He's considered the greatest detective of all time, one of the most brilliant, and certainly the most enduring. After all, he's well over 100. He died once, but the outcry over his passing was so enormous that he had no choice but to come back to life. I refer, of course, to the master detective of 221B Baker Street, Mr. Sherlock Holmes.
The very essence of Victorian London, Sherlock Holmes has been the subject of more films, books, and even biographies than any other character in English literature. Although he never existed, his home is as famous as he is, 221B Baker Street. Holmes's most famous victory was against the Hound of the Baskervilles.
It's an ugly, dangerous business, Watson.
The genius that Arthur Conan Doyle created in the 1880s has become a real person for millions.
But the curious thing is how many people there are in the world who are perfectly convinced that he is a living human being.
At the same time that Jack the Ripper was front-page news, Conan Doyle became the godfather of modern crime fiction.
Although crime may not pay, it certainly sells.
Holmes's methods were frequently scientific.
Well, actually, I think that Sherlock Holmes's approach to crime scene investigation in particular was amazingly good.
He fought against the most evil villains of Victorian England, as well as the demons in himself.
Holmes's mind stagnated without excitement, and drugs were one way he sought it.
But his clients were from the highest levels of society, and his place in history is assured.
With Holmes, you're talking legend.
His greatest friend was Dr. John Watson. He has the key to the most intriguing mystery of all. What sort of man was Sherlock Holmes? From America to Japan and Germany to Australia, there are well over 100 Sherlock Holmes societies around the world. Intelligent guesswork from these enthusiastic followers of the greatest detective makes the 6th of January an important date.
Ladies and gentlemen of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London, thank you for braving the London smog to be with us tonight in this very hotel once used by Sir Henry Baskerville. Tonight, we celebrate the birthday of Sherlock Holmes. We in this society like to play the game, as we call it, to pretend that he was a real consulting detective and Conan Doyle, the literary associate of the enterprise. There is one man who is better qualified than any other to act as our expert witness, one man who knew the master better than anyone else. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Watson.
Thank you. It's a great privilege to be invited to address such an august body. I only wish that Holmes could be here too, but as you may know, he has now retired to the country to study the art of apiary, beekeeping, as it's more commonly known. Now, my memory has never been entirely reliable, but I will do my best to answer the question which I think is on everybody's lips. What was he like to know? Sherlock Holmes. Well, of course, we have the case histories. Holmes very kindly allowed me to retell our adventures in a series of late Victorian publications, of which Strand Magazine in London and Collier's in the United States of America are the best known. We lived, of course, in Baker Street in West London. Ah, happy days. 221B was the epitome of a comfortable late Victorian residence, and around him Holmes kept those items essential to his profession and to our relaxation.
But Watson first met Holmes elsewhere. The year was 1881, and the good doctor had just taken early retirement from the army. A chance encounter with an old friend at the Criterion Bar led Watson to the most important introduction of his life. His friend took him to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, to meet an eccentric student who was looking for someone to share rooms with. The event was later recorded in the very first Sherlock Holmes story to be published, in the 1887 Beeton's Christmas Annual. At the time, Holmes was conducting an experiment on the identification of bloodstains. Today, the same room commemorates the historic meeting.
I immediately recognized his amazing powers of deduction when he pointed out that I had just returned from Afghanistan. How did he know? Well, he explained later. I'd been introduced to him as a doctor, but I also had the air of a military man. My skin was tanned, but my face was haggard, clearly the result of a tropical disease. He also noticed that I carried my left arm in an unnatural manner, which he deduced quite correctly was the result of a recent injury. Afghanistan, he concluded, was the only place in the tropics where an English army doctor at that time could recently have sustained such an injury. Elementary.
The inspiration for Holmes and his deductive powers was Professor Joseph Bell of Edinburgh University, under whom the young Conan Doyle studied medicine.
And I used, as a student, to have an old professor, his name was Bell, who was extraordinarily quick at deductive work. He would look at the patient, he would hardly allow the patient to open his mouth, but he would make his diagnosis of the disease and also very often of the patient's nationality and occupation and other points entirely by his power of observation. So naturally I thought to myself, well, if a scientific man like Bell was to come into the detective business, he wouldn't do these things by chance. He'd get the thing by building it up scientifically.
The classic Strand magazine illustrations, this was Holmes in disguise in The Final Problem, came about by chance. Conan Doyle chose Walter Paget to be the illustrator of his stories, but his brother, Sidney Paget, opened the letter by mistake. Sidney not only took the commission, but went on to use his brother's rather aquiline features as the model for Sherlock Holmes. At the time Conan Doyle wrote A Study in Scarlet, he was trying, unsuccessfully, to run a medical practice in London's Montague Street. Less than half a mile away, Baker Street had always been a busy thoroughfare. London in the 1880s was not only the centre of the British Empire, but also, to its luckier residents, it was the most civilized place in the known world. The descendant of country squires in the north of England, it has been calculated from the stories that Sherlock Holmes was born on January the 6th, 1854. The event, of course, went unrecognized in the Times newspaper of that date, even though the newly invented electric telegraph was already in use. Other than Holmes's own assertion that he was related to the French artist Vernet, little is known of his childhood. We know nothing of his parents. He was a solitary individual, his brother Mycroft being the only close relative with whom he kept in touch. The English upper-class habit of sending their children away to boarding school may help to explain his character. In fact, a great deal of information about Holmes comes not from the text of the stories, but from the kind of deductions about his life Holmes himself might have made.
It's quite possible that there was, in Holmes' childhood, some strange mystery, which may in part explain his later behavior. I know that there are some who even believe that there was an unfortunate personal encounter between Holmes's mother and his arch-enemy, Professor Moriarty. Well, after many years' close association, I can only say that my good friend's childhood was always a closed book to me.
The effects of childhood on adult life were studied by another intellectual giant of the age, Sigmund Freud. His interpretation of dreams was to revolutionize psychoanalysis, and yet there are some who believe that Holmes reached similar conclusions quite independently.
Holmes and Freud were exact contemporaries and were developing very similar ideas at about the same time. For example, a significant idea in Freud's theory is the Oedipus complex, the idea that a male child develops jealousy and hatred of the father. There's an antagonism between father and son. Now, if you look at the 60 stories of the Holmes canon, no less than 23 have such a terrifying father figure in them, who very often destroys or negates the son figure.
In The Adventure of the Priory School, young Lord Arthur Saltire, whose sympathies are known to be strongly with his mother, suffers in this very way from his father, the Duke of Holdernesse. Hardly anything is known about Holmes's education. In The Glorious Scot, he told Watson that he'd been at college, possibly Oxford or Cambridge, for only 2 years. He never said what subject he studied, but he brought a formidable intellect to his work.
He was the most perfect reasoning and observing machine the world has seen. And he himself was most interested in the origins of his own ability. In The Greek Interpreter, for example, he attributed it to heredity, on the grounds that his brother Mycroft possessed it to an even greater degree than he did. In A Study in Scarlet, on the other hand, he refers to long habit, which he said enabled him to reach his lightning conclusions. In acknowledging the roles, both of inherited and acquired learning, he was well ahead of today's research into the origins of intelligence.
Well, IQ, intelligence quotient, has an average for the population of 100, so we can estimate other people by that. Now, Watson, Dr. Watson, for example, is often described as being exceptionally stupid, but this is only in comparison to Holmes. Watson, for example, was an exceptionally good writer whose works have never been out of print. Watson held the degree of Doctor of Medicine, which with us is a higher qualification, considerably higher than the basic medical qualifications. And we know that the IQ of holders of doctorates averages 130. The fact that Watson then appears stupid compared to Holmes clearly puts Holmes considerably higher than 130. The supreme enemy of Holmes, Moriarty, was an outstanding mathematician and was certainly one of the finest brains of the century. His intelligence must have been about the same as John Stuart Mill's, 190 or 200. Holmes was able to outmaneuver even Moriarty. He cut deep, yet I just undercut him, said Holmes. Therefore, Holmes's intelligence can be estimated at least 200.
Dr. Watson, I think the question we all want answered is why did Sherlock Holmes become a detective in the first place?
And was there any connection between Holmes and Jack the Ripper?
Both of them, dear lady, reached the height of their fame in the year 1888. These are deep questions which I will endeavour to answer over the next course of roast beef and Yorkshire pudding.
Sherlock Holmes, as a detective and as a man, was the product of Victorian England. The British bobby, unlike the American cop, still goes on duty without a gun, as did his Victorian predecessor. While Holmes worked with Inspectors Lestrade, Jones, and Gregson of Scotland Yard, he had a poor opinion of their abilities. In the United States, Alan Pinkerton's National Detective Agency had been founded in Chicago in 1852 and become famous for its efficiency. More than 10 years later, Scotland Yard had only 15 detectives for the whole of London, which by that time had a population of more than 3 million. In Holmes's day, the city was teeming with people, mean streets and filthy alleys crammed with the poor and starving. The workhouses of the day were full of the people who had flooded into the city from the countryside. As Watson, from his privileged position, noted, London was a great cesspool into which all the loungers of the empire were irresistibly drained. The job of the police was to stop the stench reaching polite society. As the police news showed, official attitudes were based on class prejudice. The appropriately named detectives still believed the myth that crime was committed only by the lower orders, not by the gentry.
What is interesting about Holmes is Holmes and Conan Doyle through Holmes, he completely dispels this myth. He actually shows that crime is not a pathological thing. Crime is a result of environment. It is a result of individuals' personalities. And he transcends this idea that crime is merely the product of the dangerous classes, this wonderful Victorian idea of the people of the streets, the people of the underclass. Holmes shows us that the crimes, the great criminals, can just as easily exist in the drawing rooms and the salons of the West End of London as they do in the stews and the alleyways of the East End. And I think for this reason, among many others, he is well ahead of his time, again showing how much more ahead of his time he was than any other writer and any other detective of his period.
Despite today's sensational newspaper headlines, crime and crime reporting have in fact changed very little since Holmes's day. At the time, prostitution in London was particularly widespread, as was its corrupting influence. Child labor was the norm. Holmes himself, in A Study in Scarlet, used the streetwise skills of the local youngsters, known as the Baker Street Irregulars. In London's East End, crime and degradation lurked in every alleyway. But in 1888, one grisly series of crimes gripped the nation like no other. The Whitechapel murders, the hideous work of the man still unidentified except as Jack the Ripper.
Within the sound of a Victorian policeman's whistle, from this narrow, dark street, the bodies of 5 Victorian prostitutes were found hideously mutilated, dead at the hand of the great Victorian criminal, Jack the Ripper.
The murders were front-page news. There was an insatiable appetite for all the gruesome details. Newspapers were cashing in on crime.
The crimes of Jack the Ripper were certainly helping to sell newspapers. And at the same time, we see that the stories of Sherlock Holmes are helping to sell, as it was in those days, the famous Strand magazine. And I suppose it leads us to observe that although crime may not pay, it certainly sells.
While the sensational Whitechapel murders were turned into a thrilling romance, the Strand made Sherlock Holmes a real figure to its readers. They could even smell the London smog. In describing the inclement weather in The 5 Orange Pips, Watson talks of the presence of those great elemental forces which shriek at mankind through the bars of his civilization.
In many of the stories, the weather plays a significant role. It's treated almost as a kind of impersonal force, uncontrollable. And one might say this represents the underworld that Holmes is battling against. But one might go further, I suggest, and say that in a way it's analogous to what Freud described as the id, the uncontrollable, unknown part of the personality.
By the standards of the 1880s, Holmesian deduction was formidable, but it was allied to science. Not only did the detective clearly have a sense of right and wrong, but his inquiring mind and outstanding analytic ability was based on the new discipline of forensics. His crime scene analysis was exemplary.
Well, actually, I think that Sherlock Holmes's approach to crime scene investigation in particular was amazingly good. Those first few minutes at a scene of crime are absolutely crucial. In fact, they're probably the time when the scientist works hardest. And I think Watson once described Holmes as lounging up and down on the pavement, I think it was Study in Scarlet, outside the scene of the crime, you know, nowhere near the actual room where the murder had taken place. And what he was doing was just looking for all these clues, trying to assess what had happened, the sequence of events, where the areas were, where the clues were likely to be, and what sort of clues they were, sort of how to go about getting the best evidence out of this. A very, very important time in the life of the investigation of a case.
Holmes remarked to Watson, "It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data." Science and technology were being applied to everyday life. The motor car first went into production in the 1890s. The typewriter first appeared at this time. Surgical techniques were advancing rapidly. Louis Pasteur was making breakthroughs in the field of vaccines. The telephone, invented in the 1870s, was used by Holmes in 1888.
Many of these new developments were well known to Holmes, and he even published several original pieces of research himself, which I still treasure today. The typewriter and its relation to crime, the tracing of footsteps, with some remarks upon the uses of plaster of Paris as a preserver of impresses, which was of great value in solving the case of the sign of 4.
Such had been the success of the first story, A Study in Scarlet, that a second followed in 1890. The sign of 4 contained elements that were to recur in later stories. When intellectual stimulation was absent, Holmes sought the chemical alternatives. Watson recorded that Holmes's sinewy forearm and wrist was dotted and scarred with innumerable puncture marks. He alternated between morphine and cocaine, which he always took in a 7% solution. Holmes himself believed that although its influence was physically bad, cocaine was transcendingly stimulating and clarifying to the mind. At the time, such drugs were legally available and regularly taken by many of the so-called aesthetes, including the poet Coleridge and even Queen Victoria herself. But in the 1890s, it was not realized that addiction could be dangerous.
Holmes was at least partly addicted to cocaine, and he was also a very heavy smoker. You have to remember that cocaine was legal at that time, so these were on a par. And one reason, undoubtedly, was to seek excitement. Holmes's mind stagnated without excitement, and drugs were one way he sought it.
Despite, or possibly because of Holmes's heightened senses, the boat chase on the River Thames, which concluded the sign of 4, resulted in yet another triumph of good over evil.
Holmes's great ability, his brilliance, if you like, was his ability to be able to adduce from the facts that he had ascertained at the scene, his ability to be able to turn those into a picture, to provide himself with the ability to identify the person that he was looking for, the suspect. And even today, it is well worth remembering some of the if you like, the tenets of his skills. The phrase that springs to mind is when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, no matter how improbable, must be the truth.
Holmes's discovery of the improbable powers of the poisoned darts used by the diminutive Andaman islander Tonga was crucial to the outcome of the sign of 4.
The resolution of the case was a happy one for me, less so for Holmes. After all, he had done all the work. Jones of the Yard got all the credit. What remained for Holmes? I'll tell you. As he stretched up his long white fingers to the mantelpiece, he replied, "For me, Watson, there still remains the cocaine bottle." Delightful apple pie.
For many, happiness is quite straightforward. A glass of wine, good company, and in Watson's case, a good woman. As he himself commented in the sign of 4,
I have an experience of women which extends over many nations and 3 separate continents.
For Holmes, life was more complicated.
He told me, women are not entirely to be trusted, Watson. Not even the best of them.
Holmes, as far as we know, never succeeded in forming a close emotional relationship with any woman. He seems to regard such relationships as interfering with his own pure, rational thought processes. Why this should be, we don't know. It might relate to his early childhood, of which we know very, very little. But his attitude to women was really one, a rather scornful, even arrogant attitude.
But these characteristics, in particular the arrogance, were symptomatic of the age of empire. Thanks to Admiral Lord Nelson, amongst others, Britannia had ruled the waves for nearly a century. As explorers pushed into the unknown, a third of the globe was tinged with the pink that signified the Great British Empire. This was also the age of steam. Bradshaw's Railway Guide, the vocabulary of which is described by Holmes as nervous and terse, but limited, was nevertheless his Bible. speed of both travel and communication were vital to the successful conclusion of many cases, including the Hound of the Baskervilles. Such was Holmes's international reputation that at various times he worked not only for the British government, but also the royal houses of Bohemia and the Netherlands, as well as the illustrious client widely believed to be King Edward VII. But essentially, Sherlock Holmes was a very private man. The feminine touch was noticeably absent from the sitting room of 221B Baker Street. His fight against crime was single-minded, but although his method of thought was meticulous, his personal habits were not. In The Adventure of the Musgrave Ritual, Watson describes one wall as being adorned by a patriotic VR done in bullet pox. Holmes's tobacco was kept in the toe end of a Persian slipper, his unanswered correspondence pinned to the mantelpiece by a jackknife. But music was his greatest solace. His violin, bought in London's Tottenham Court Road, was a Stradivarius. In the case of the Red-Headed League, Holmes himself talked of Violin Land, where all is sweetness and delicacy and harmony. As Holmes's reputation grew, so did that of his creator, Conan Doyle.
At first, I think they attracted very little attention. But after time, when I began the short adventures, one after the other, coming out month after month in the Strand magazine, people began to recognize that it was different to the old detective, that there was something there which was new. They began to buy the magazine, and it prospered. So I may say did I. We both came along together, and from that time, Sherlock Holmes fairly took root.
Edgar Allan Poe's Murders in the Rue Morgue was written in 1841 and was in fact the first printed detective story. But modern crime writers are almost unanimous in their praise for the Holmes stories.
Crime fiction was invented by Edgar Allan Poe. People have said he was the grandfather. The godfather was Conan Doyle. He took a genre which had been invented in America, and in Britain he created, and then for the world he created, this incredible fictional phenomenon. Everybody reads crime fiction. He didn't invent it, but he made it incredibly popular at a time when there was no radio, there was no television. They just queued up for those stories. That was 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. We're still reading the stories.
But in 1893, Conan Doyle decided that he had had enough of his most famous creation. The Agent of Doom was to be his deadliest enemy, the Napoleon of crime, Professor Moriarty.
This is a duel between you and me, Mr. Holmes. If you are clever enough to bring destruction on me, rest assured, I shall do as much for you.
If I were assured of the former eventuality, I would, in the interests of the public, cheerfully accept the latter.
I can promise you the one, but not the other.
After a chase across Europe, the final struggle took place in Switzerland at the Reichenbach Falls. Watson was left in no doubt about Holmes's untimely death. It was a shattering blow, not only to him, but also to millions of the great detective's admirers. After the case of the final problem, no new Holmes stories appeared in the Strand. he was presumed dead.
Dr. Watson, Holmes's death must have been a terrible shock for you.
Dear lady, it was. But an even greater shock was to occur 3 years later. To fill the void, I was myself trying to play the detective. The case of the Honourable Ronald Adair was the talk of London in spring 1894. The victim was murdered in this fashionable Park Lane address. Outside the house, I bumped into an old man carrying a stack of books. As Holmes would have remarked, I could see, but I did not observe. Shortly afterwards, the same old man called on me at my Kensington residence. To my astonishment, he revealed himself as none other than Sherlock Holmes, as ever, the master of disguise.
The truth was that Holmes was Conan Doyle's greatest creation. Much as the writer might have his mind on other literary matters, his commercial instincts did not desert him.
I've written a good deal more about him than I ever intended to do, but my hand has been rather forced by kind friends who continually wanted to know more. And so it is that this monstrous growth has come out of what was really a comparatively small seed.
Conan Doyle, I imagine, like all of us, wrote finally for money. He killed Holmes off because Holmes had become the monster he couldn't control. He was getting in his way. But interestingly, at the end of the Reichenbach Falls, the door is left open. There's no body. There's no proof he's dead. So a few years later, by which time people are desperate for new Sherlock Holmes and other people are prepared to pay a lot of money, he can reappear. Not rise from the dead, that would be silly, but just reappear. Very clever career move, that.
Holmes had made a miraculous escape from the Reichenbach Falls. He said that he had spent the intervening years traveling, probably in disguise, in Tibet, Khartoum, and Mecca, amongst other exotic places. But there's been much speculation about the truth of Holmes's own account of the so-called hiatus.
Following the death of Moriarty at the Reichenbach Falls, Holmes disappeared for 3 years. Now, this has been explained in a number of ways. He said he was travelling in Tibet, but the story is very, very implausible. My suggestion is that he was suffering from a rare condition known as a fugue state, a flight from reality, but also a physical flight. Now, this is extremely rare, but it does occur. It's well recognised. We have to ask, what was Holmes's personality like? Now, Holmes was what we call an extreme extrovert. He craved excitement. He was very volatile. He was also well able to put events out of his mind. He was also noted for disappearing on frequent occasions with no explanation of where he'd been. He was also a master of disguise. In other words, he was good at assuming another personality. And my suggestion is that under the intolerable stress of the conflict with Moriarty, Holmes went into such a fugue state and disappeared for 3 years. In fact, he didn't know where he'd been.
But back in Baker Street, Holmes now faced another enemy. One of Moriarty's henchmen also knew he was back in London and was hot on his trail. The case of the empty house was resolved by the use of a wax dummy. The potential assassin, Colonel Moran, mistook the waxwork for Holmes and only succeeded in putting a bullet through its temple.
Holmes and I overpowered him after a brief struggle. Most of our work together dealt with mere human danger, but not always. The world is not yet ready for the case of the giant rat of Sumatra. But no biography of Holmes would be complete without an examination of his greatest triumph in The Hound of the Baskervilles. This, indeed, was a three-pipe problem. This very establishment in which we are dining is part of the original Northumberland Hotel. It was here that Sir Henry Baskerville, on his arrival from North America, first stayed, and, crucially, was relieved of an old boot. This event was immediately seized on by Holmes as a vital clue.
The entire Baskerville family was being threatened by an ancient curse dating back some 300 years to the infamous Hugo Baskerville. The family seat, far from London, was in Dartmoor, a wild and desolate place in the southwest of England. It is most notable for its prison. Built to contain French prisoners from the Napoleonic Wars, it also housed American prisoners from the War of 1812. In the story, the Notting Hill murderer, Selden, was incarcerated here. The curse that haunted Baskerville Hall had begun the night the wicked Hugo hunted a poor young woman on the moor. Legend said she had been saved when a hound from hell had appeared and killed her molester. When Holmes took on the case, the last of the line, Henry Baskerville, had just arrived from Canada to take up his position as Lord of the Baskerville Manor. The spectral hound had returned and was suspected of causing the violent death of Sir Henry's predecessor. Its terrifying howl wailed across the lonely moorland, a nightmare become reality.
It's an ugly, dangerous business, Watson.
Watson and Sir Henry Baskerville took the train to Dartmoor. Sir Henry described the house as glimmering like a ghost at the end of the long, dark drive. The climax took place on the moor, as Sir Henry was used by Holmes as a decoy to unravel the mystery. A lonely graveyard high on the moor is the final resting place of what may well be the last of the Baskervilles. After his retirement, Sherlock Holmes left behind an extraordinary legacy. There have been over 24,000 books and articles published about Sherlock Holmes so far. The 4 novels and 56 shorter stories in the so-called canon have never been out of print. The Strand magazine itself ceased publication in 1950, but not before Agatha Christie, P.G. Wodehouse, and H.G. Wells had added their contributions to Conan Doyle's.
For those of us who are crime writers, there's no question about who is the greatest detective. We all know who the greatest detective is. We might argue about who the second greatest is, but the greatest is indisputably Sherlock Holmes. If you think of great detectives, you can think of Philip Marlowe, Kinsey Mulhone, Steve Carella, Lord Peter Wimsey, Father Brown. That list is endless, and they are great detectives. But as soon as you reach Sherlock Holmes, you're talking legend.
The first actor to play Holmes on stage was William Gillette. Never referred to in the stories, the famous deerstalker hat was first worn by Gillette. The Dane, Otto Logoni, was one of the first actors to play Holmes on the silent screen in 1910. In 1922, foggy London town was recreated for Ellie Norwood, who holds the record with a total of 47 Holmes films. He was also a particular favorite of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle.
Mrs. Douglas, I suggest that you tell me the truth.
Mr. Holmes!
Arthur Watner made 5 films in the 30s.
Couldn't possibly have lived in America without knowing. That mark is the brand of the scullery.
Well, I'm bound to admit, Holmes, I've never heard of them.
Oh, I can well believe that was.
Errol Flynn was one of over 100 cinematic Holmes so far. For many, the most memorable was Basil Rathbone, playing opposite Nigel Bruce's bumbling Watson, dubbed into many languages. And The Hound of the Baskervilles remains the favorite cinematic story, resulting in 6 films so far. The Greeks have taken to Holmes, and the Japanese are amongst his greatest fans. In Baker Street today, every item of Holmes' regalia can be bought, along with endless souvenirs, some of which might have made the great detective raise a caustic eyebrow. As he once commented, there is but one step from the grotesque to the horrible. He has been a gift to the advertising industry. His taste in tobacco and fine wines is reflected in an appropriately named range of products. The spirit of Holmes lives on in London today. Baker Street Station, part of it built in Victorian times, still pays homage to a famous traveller. This is the Scotland Yard that Holmes would have known, and today's detectives still acknowledge their debt to the great detective.
The nice thing about going to detective training school in this country and being trained by our instructors was that we were positively encouraged to go back and have a look at the works of Sherlock Holmes because of the serious messages that they possessed for us as trainee detectives.
There are similarities between Holmes's approach to crime scene investigation and that of the modern-day forensic scientist, and particular with the importance he placed on observation at the start of his examination, and his experience played a great part in the deductions he could make. And experience is a great thing a very important attribute of the forensic scientist. I think Holmes had done over 1,000 cases, and certainly that's the sort of number that you would expect a really experienced forensic scientist to have done these days.
By today's numbering, 221B Baker Street has been completely rebuilt. It is now the site of the Abbey National Building Society, one of Britain's best-known financial institutions. Holmes has always received a large postbag.
I get letters asking for his autograph, get letters addressed to his rather stupid friend, Watson. I've even had ladies writing to say that they'd be very glad to act as his housekeeper. One of them, when she heard that he had turned to the occupation of keeping bees, wrote saying that she was an expert at segregating the queen, whatever that may mean, and that she was evidently predestined to be the housekeeper of Sherlock Holmes.
Despite Holmes's retirement, 2,000 letters a year still arrive asking for his advice.
Dear Mr. Holmes, I have lost my sister. My father has agreed to pay for your airfare if you come to speak to my class.
Rely on your discretion.
Holmes should treat Dr. Watson with respect. Not like he's a nobody.
I would like to name the first investment club in Argentina, Sherlock, in your honor.
Each inquiry receives an answer, and Holmes himself has received the ultimate stamp of approval from the British establishment. Although still writing into the 1920s, Conan Doyle left Holmes securely in the late 1800s. The great detective symbolized a past era. He was essentially upright, incorruptible, and omniscient. His creator, a great storyteller.
I often tell people, read the books again. You know the stories, you know the characters, but read them for their style. It's a wonderfully spare, very clear style. It's as great a style as, say, Mark Twain. And people forget this, and I think it's one of the reasons the books have become classics. He was ahead of his time. If you think of Victorian literature, and he began as a late Victorian, it was very florid, very overwritten. Not with him. It's a very modern style. He was an outstanding writer. He was a great storyteller.
Conan Doyle died in 1930. His greatest creation lives on. This eccentric Englishman from another age has become immortal. His weaknesses only make him human. Sherlock Holmes is the ultimate reasoning machine, the hope of lost causes, the champion of justice.
Sherlock Holmes was and is so popular, he literally changed the face of London. At least one part of it, Baker Street. Like Holmes himself, that address was imaginary. The street number never existed. But when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle died in 1930, the number 41 Upper Baker Street officially became 221B Baker Street in honor of his greatest creation. Playing the game, indeed.
To Holmes, it's all been quite elementary. My friends, his life was packed full of adventure and intrigue, and it has been my pleasure to act as his Boswell. Ours has been too short a stroll through the shady groves of Holmesian academe. But to the true scholar, the game is still afoot.